The Watchtower rejection of tradition, even its own. That the Watchtower and other cults should reject the universal tradition of the Church, which in creeds is still recited by Christians, Orthodox, Roman Catholic and Protestant, has survived 1900 years intact, is best explained by witnesses' failure to comprehend the balanced view of Paradosis. When Christ criticized the scribes and Pharisees for holding fast to traditions, he was speaking of the precepts of men. That's Matthew 15, verse 9. These human doctrines were preferred to the Mosaic and prophetic traditions. In other words, Christ lambasted his religious leaders for their new lights, which had shoved out of sight the commandments divinely revealed. Mark 7, verses 8 and 9. The older tradition had been nicely set aside to accommodate human teaching. Jeremiah made a similar protest to religious innovators in his day, who preferred the carnal delights of Baalism to the ancient paths, as Jeremiah put it. That's Jeremiah 6:16 and 7 verse 9. What Jehovah's Witnesses and others rejecting tradition in toto don't seem to understand is that the traditions of the scribes were not old teachings, but recent innovations, going back likely no more than 400 years or so, to the time of the last Old Testament books. Christ by no means rejected all tradition, but rather your tradition, he said. The innovations of the sectarian scribes and Pharisees to whom he was talking. That's Matthew 15, 1 and 6. As Alfred Plummer says in his commentary on Matthew, quote, "These scribes professed to be zealous defenders of God's law, but what they really cared about was their own traditions about that law," unquote. There's no record, for instance, that Christ or the apostles condemned the festival of Purim, a festival introduced in the time of Esther, despite its Persian connections. Nor did they condemn Hanukkah, the festival commemorating the Maccabean victory over their Hasmonean oppressors. Both these festivals were religious innovations, not commanded by God, but the Jews still keep them today. Official Watchtower reference books acknowledge much of this. For example, Insight on the Scriptures tells us that part of the valid tradition of the apostles was Paul's counsel to the Thessalonians referred to above. Quote from the Insight book says this: "The teachings and examples set by the apostles constituted valid tradition. Thus Paul, who had personally toiled with his own hands so not to be a financial burden on his brothers, could urge the Thessalonian Christians to withdraw from every brother walking disorderly and not according to the tradition," that's Paradosis, "they had received. One who would not work was plainly not following the fine example or tradition of the apostles." That's from 2 Thessalonians 3, 6 to 11. This is fine and scriptural, but no upper echelon Watchtower leader works with his hands in the tradition of the apostles. Yeah. There is no evidence that C.T. Russell or J.F. Rutherford did either. All of them are and were supported totally by the Watchtower Society. This is one Watchtower tradition that has remained consistent, while others have dropped by the wayside. Among such discarded teachings, we might list most of the contents of the 7 volumes of Studies in the Scriptures, for 40 years publicly promoted as indispensable to the correct understanding of the Bible. The Watchtower no longer prints these books, nor indeed any of the books it used as preaching tools during the first 8 decades of Watchtower history. Surely, this disavowal even of its founders' works is a unique characteristic of the Watchtower. The doctrine of progressive truth has been used both to excuse the Watchtower's multitude of false predictions and altered doctrines, and to explain how it is that no one other than Jehovah's Witnesses has ever held to their peculiar interpretations of the Bible. Point out that even Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe what the Watchtower once proclaimed as present truth, and your Jehovah's Witness will likely reply, the light gets brighter and brighter, admitting neither accountability for or connection with the Watchtower's early leaders. Even the Watchtower's present good news, "You can live forever in paradise on earth," that was the textbook we were promoting door to door in the 80s. That was their best-selling book also, since the Truth book, by the way. it's admitted to be a preaching innovation adopted since 1935. So we should say that again. The title of their best-selling book of the last 40 years, You Can Live Forever in Paradise on Earth, is admitted to be a new gospel since 1935. So in conclusion, we wanted to go to Deuteronomy chapter 32 and read a few verses about the beginning of biblical tradition to get a better handle on how God thought we could head off this problem of historical discontinuity. He called that group of people that were around him before he died, Moses called them, that generation that fell in the wilderness, a perverse and crooked generation, a foolish and unwise people. So follow along in Deuteronomy 32 verses 4 to 9.
The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity. Just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children, because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is not he your Father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage.
Remember, consult your fathers, consult your elders. So the protective memory was the collective memory. It didn't depend upon an infallible and inerrant scriptural. That's a great advantage to have that too. But in the early stages of Israel's history, this was the way things were going to be transmitted faithfully. So we conclude the tract by saying, so Moses described the generation that stood on the brink of the promised land. And what did their perversity consist? In what did their perversity consist? They had forgotten the rock, the God of faithfulness, who had led his people from days long before the Exodus. If they were disloyal, corrupt children, it was entirely their own fault. For if they had desired to know this most precious truth, that God is the eternal I Am, as reliable as rock in his consistency and faithfulness, all they had to do was remember the days of old, consider the years of all generations, ask your father, and he will inform you, your elders, and they will tell you. Verse 7. This perversely is exactly what Watchtower leaders have consistently refused to do. Respecting no light but their own, they do not even honor the teachings of their own spiritual fathers. Therefore their good news, another gospel even by their own admission than the one preached by Christendom for all these centuries, and a different message even from the one spread all over the earth by the Watchtower's missionaries before 1935, stands self-condemned.